Thank you, Professor Simonjic. We will now begin our formal program with our opening keynote lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Adam Geczy from the University of Sydney, Australia, for his presentation titled The Death of Valentino, Fashion and the Fragmentation of Glamour and Taste.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very honoured to be here. It's evening here in Sydney, and I'll have to apologise because I will have to leave after my speech because I have to make dinner for my family. So, but thank you very much. It's given me a lot of pause for thought, and I will be looking towards also turning what you've spurred me to do into a full paper. So thank you again as well. So I'm going to embark on, I've tried to make sure that this is the right length so as to ensure that we have enough time for questions should need be. Okay, so the death of Valentino, fashion and fragmentation of glamour and taste. After the death of Givenchy in 218 and Armani in 225, Valentino was arguably the last designer symbolizing an age of glamour and prosperity that witnessed its heyday in that 1960s post-war boom. It was a time when women were women, men were men, and wearing fur was not an insult or a social solecism. We can now use Valentino's death at the beginning of 226 and Armani's towards the end of the year before as a symbolic break in fashion where luxury, style, and gender meant a multitude of things. Along with Givenchy, while far from unique, we can also count in Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger, Jill Sander. These designers were synonymous with fine lines, a sharp and defined silhouette, excellent tailoring, and styles that were restrained enough to be called universal, and for that, highly versatile. It helped that the fashions of such designers became firmly enmeshed in the Hollywood glamour and celebrity system. From Audrey Hepburn, Givenchy, or Richard Gere, Armani, performances and narratives were woven into the same syntax of classic fashion, where it became the index of prosperity and desirability, and above all, mobility. Yet this marker of classic, or let me say high classic, is no longer the regnant style, perhaps still in films where the emphasis is not on clothing, but in life. Queer, odd, excessive, inverted, bended, and exaggerated fashions are today not only accepted, but the norm. Thus, arguably, we cannot set queer fashion apart, but as within the fragmentation in which queer is the norm. This is because normativity has become just another category hiding under the guise of classic. Yet even now, what is considered classic is itself variable and relative, and the generic notion of classic is just habitual, vernacular clothing, or a category unto itself. To put this another way, no longer is classic a default or nodal category from which others differentiated themselves. Rather, it is now one in the firmament of many, and increasingly an historical artifact. The notion of classic taste is a modern one, and one that begins with the so-called Great Male Renunciation, to use John Flugel's phrase, of the late 18th century. As a result of the French Revolution's condemnation of the flamboyant and expensive styles of the Ancien Régime, the simplification of men's fashions was primarily a bourgeois phenomenon. Although there were still class differentiators, the nature of these changed significantly. It must be remembered that one of the ways in which Louis XIV kept his court in check at Versailles was through clothes, not just in the superiority of what he wore, but of ensuring that the nobility were under pressure of competing among themselves, which was ensured that all but the very rich were financially debilitated. Before the 19th century, dress was additive in terms of the richness of the number of appointments, whereas with the reductive fashions of the 19th and 20th centuries were based around tailoring and fabrics, subtlety over spectacle, so subtle, in fact, that it led Charles Baudelaire to quip that it was hard to discern between the differences between classes from a distance. The pared-down fashions not only allowed a greater number of people access to fine dress, but also made it easier for individuals to break from them, as in the dandy. The dandy, an early subset of queer identity, distinguished himself through excessive fastidiousness and embellished accents. Although not all dandies were gay, they were queer inasmuch as they separated themselves from a normative standard. What is important here is that there was such a standard which made such deviations easy and evident. Another example of this, and more germane to gay men of the early 20th century, were the so-called New Edwardians, who signified their sexual difference through pseudo-aristocratic affectations such as pinky rings and suede shoes that existed in the early 20th century. Once again, such signifiers were not confined to gay men's culture and therefore less liable to reproach, but they were sufficiently evident as a code that differentiated itself from other straight men. That the 20th century witnessed not one but two major wars did not help change the notion of normative dress codes. Menswear needed to be practical, affordable, which meant easy to produce and allow mobility. Similarly, women's involvement in the war effort in the First World War was decisive in the transition away from the complex forms of dress still adopted until war broke out. Given restrictions to all commodities, including fabrics, it was unseemly for women, even after the war, to adopt ostentatious ways of dressing. It was also in the opening decades of the 20th century that clothing adopted codes of maneuverability and sportiness. And with mass market produced clothing, which was also accelerated due to the war effort in producing uniforms, clothing and dress became increasingly standardized, which also meant that flamboyant, long a euphemism for queer, ways of dressing were just as conspicuous. It was not until the new generation born during or just after the Second World War that had not witnessed its restrictions and depredations that a different attitude to dress was born. The protest and countercultural movements of the 1960s and 70s were hostile to the conservatism occasioned by the post-war years. The series Mad Men is frequently cited as providing a vivid snapshot of the restrictive mores of dress in the 1950s. The culture of the 1960s was a chaotic mix of experimentation, sexual promiscuity, and appearances that were purposely and self-evidently hostile to the image of respectability. Queerness was enmeshed in countless manifestations of nonconformity, all of which were treated by the establishment as a kind of social sickness, much as in line with the way homosexuals were still being diagnosed as psychologically aberrant. The 1960s witnessed a sizable shift between different forms of clothing with a more mainstream attitude to uniformity and more flamboyant experimental styles. While the 1969 Stonewall riots marks an important marker in the recognition of gay and lesbian rights, there continued to be a mistrust for what was deemed flamboyant in fashions, which became associated with the 1970s disco club set. As has now been popularized, the 1970s countercultural fashions were characterized by rich florals and bright colors. It might also be noted that the brand Benetton was founded in 1965. Its primary selling point was in specializing in a broad range of vivid colors as counter to the sober tones that were still dominant. The critical hitch for Benetton was that the clothes were simple and geared to general, not queer market, effectively making flamboyant fashion palatable. Benetton would later fall because it could not manage the pace of emergent fast fashion, typified today by H&M and Zara, which still propagate mostly classic fashion styles, but only to appeal to the broadest consumer base for commercial reasons alone. By the 1980s, the nature of transgressive fashion had changed, either through exhaustion or become the members of the protest generation grew older and settled down, and many who identified as queer wanted to be taken seriously as members of the professional mainstream. With the 1980s, a new form of corporate professional, both men and women, emerged where the yuppie placed the hippie. Power dressing became an accepted term in which fashion was recognized as a key integer in assessing agency and success. Sharp tapering lines, double-breasted suits and shoulder pads were part of this look and adopted by both men and women as a way of asserting their corporate savoir-faire. Already in the 1970s, Givenchy had begun to make his reputation for high-end elegance, while by the 1980s, Armani and Ralph Lauren had become mainstays of classic style. While no doubt a loose term that deferred to the timelessness of Greco-Roman aesthetic, classic at this time entered into currency to differentiate from an aberrant style. That is, what was restrained as opposed to extravagant or exaggerated. Timelessness and variants thereof were used to sediment classic as belonging to a higher order that relegated other styles to transient and incidental. Such a topology and dynamic is essential for understanding the shift today. Classic, while plainly a category, was at the same time defiant of categorization as it defied everything that it was not. By the turn of the millennium in the 1990s, countercultural and subcultural styles had become subsumed into mainstream fashion. This meant that they could no longer be separated from other fashions as rebellious degradations or repositioning. Rather, as a material demonstration of how capitalism is clever in absorbing dissent to its own benefit, subcultural style existed as a metaphor and a trope, an inflection that gestured towards rebellion without ever effecting it. Without going too far into the ramifications of the politics of such changes, the fashions of the new millennium exhibited a radical dispersion of fashion codes in which the semantics of fashion could no longer be taken as evidence of an identity position. The 1990s, for example, saw the emergence of the metrosexual, of a new man, where the codes and practices formerly attributable to women became acceptable, if not desirable, for men, from skin to hair care to fragrances. These changes were not so much the feminization of masculinity, but a broadening of what masculinity could signify and to which it could aspire. It was at this time that unisex fragrances were no longer an exception, suggesting that the gendered corollaries between colours, smells, and styles had broken down. Perhaps less from money, but by the early 2000s, Valentino and Ralph Lauren added loud and hedonistic kinds of fashion to their standard pret-a-porter range. It was in the 1910s that neo-Edwardian and dandy menswear fashion became popular, as seen in the slimmer figure with the correspondingly slimmer cut, together with raised pants coupled with motley coloured socks. A designer such as Tom Brown has built his career on the queerifying of the classic through small variation. Yet this syntax of queer is, just as the subsumption of subcultural identifiers, is not limited or even associated with queer itself, which is dramatically different from the subtle signs used by gay men right up until the 1970s, when an array of coloured handkerchiefs stuffed into various pockets of their jeans was used to signify what kinds of sex they were into. If we can accept that the entry of queer, flamboyant, extravagant, and divergent fashion into the fabric and line of classic, then we also need to acknowledge that classic has been permanently vitiated, spoiled, infected, whatever word you want to use, show that the heteronormative permanence, inviolability, and purity is not disrupted as we enter the world of the fluidity of gender and the cyborg, where is not only disrupted as we enter the fluidity of gender and cyborg, where the polarities of gender are convenient reference points for the definition of the multiple variants from them. These changes, which in the history of human civilization have befallen us with extraordinary speed and to the consternation of some, are best seen on the surface of the skin, in terms of the body and how it is made to appear, clothed or not. For this reason, allow me to end with an example that is difficult to refute and which all of you can relate to in one way or another: tattoos. Until very recently, since perhaps the 1980s perhaps, tattoos were associated with specific groups and types: the military, gangsters, social misfits, prostitutes, and queers. They were worn with pride by such people for how they spurned social politeness and for the kinds of alternative belonging they signified. Now, how often are you astonished by the number of times you see tattoos from doctors and professors to fine dining waiters, all guardians of the establishment? There is no stigma in tattoos anymore. It's just a style unto itself, and increasingly seen as a desirable choice. Classic used to equate to the body marked only by the signs of nature, and all else that was disturbed by artificial alteration. If the reverse may not quite be the case, where tattoos are the norm, what we might safely assert, at least, is that when we see an untattooed body, it is not pure, it is simply waiting to be marked. We are all queer now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Geczy. We now have time for questions from the audience. Does anyone have a point that they would like to raise or a question for our speaker?
I hope I made myself clear. I didn't stumble. I stumbled over a few words, but
hello, maybe I can ask. Hi, my name is Matea Fait. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and talk. I would like to ask you, or maybe if you explore more with this wonderful ending that you had, that we are all queer now, in reflecting on, let's say, the minority groups or the subcultural groups, how does this popularization or this expansion of the codes or this specific little things that that the communities, smaller communities had, that is now popularized, how does this, do you see it as lowering this political potential of the groups in sense of the radical perspectives, or their also being proud of being, you know, a part of a minority group, of this power that groups one had or still have? I don't know if you can elaborate on that. How do you see the political potential? Does it all become more watery, or does this pink washing happen, or do you see that this is more of a liberation in sense that it's becoming more democratized or more expand? So yeah, thank you.
thank you. That's an excellent question, and it is something that I've thought about and discussed and worked with for a long time. In the first edition of Queer Style, which I've dated with my colleague Vicky Karaminas, we talk about this idea of the troping of subcultural styles, and we use the example of the mohawk of Beckham. So previously, the idea of to give a concrete example, which we must with fashion, the punk fashions were were not simply aesthetic; they were socially dynamic. So, in other words, the punk fashion was geared not just towards a look from a distance, like the classic objectifying. It was geared towards having a dynamic causal relation to make people uncomfortable. So the idea was that the punk would sit next to someone in the metro and make the man with the suit feel uncomfortable. That was the idea. It was active discomfort. It had a dynamic function, and its aesthetics had a material dynamic function. Now, so I've worked now for on and off 30 years in art schools, and it's an example I've used in class over 10 years ago. If someone walks in with green hair and a nose ring, no one even looks at him or her. It's art school. It's design school, right? So that's the first part of your question, that this has become democratized. And the question that you're asking is that this meant that the radical styles of subversive styles, have they been rendered toothless? That's what you're asking, yeah? Have they been read? Has it? So this is the positive and negative, is that everyone is allowed. So I purposely worn my Armani Exchange grey polo, absolute classic. I purposely wore that. But if I came in with a very, very elaborate Versace shirt, you would still listen to me and take me just as seriously, which is the point. And so the question you're asking is has it been rendered toothless? And to some degree it has, but it's a trade-off with the democratization that has allowed a variety of different kinds of freedoms. But it's also, and I think this idea of the fluidity of fashion, I think it's a very contested idea. I prefer to think of fluidity of fashion in terms of the fluidity of our own identities, of the way you're sitting one morning in a comfortable shirt, but tonight you may decide to don something else, put on lipstick. This is my current project with Karaminas on lipstick, which is also has multiple. Lipstick is used has been used objectifying women, but it's also been used for female empowerment in the suffragettes and so on. So the thing is that what's important to note, and again, this is up for debate, but it's a fairly firmly held notion. There is no anti-fashion. Anti-fashion is a subset of fashion. Okay, so I reiterate, there is no outside to fashion, and this is also one way of getting people to understand what contemporary art is. There is no outside. So what's happening in fashion is also in contemporary art. There is no outside. There is no avant-garde. So within that, there are, within the freeing of constraints, yes, the kind of age of revolution, the radicalism. So this is reflected anyway in the politics and the breaking down on left and right, and the way in which we don't have a protest and social movement in the way there was in the 1960s. And so therefore, you know, as I said at the end of my talk, when you go to see your doctor and your doctor has a tattoo, you're no longer astonished, or you don't question his or her expertise. And yes, on one hand, but this is not just part of fashion. This is to do with a complete reboot and a re-understanding of contemporary politics that fashion reflects. And I prefer to see this as the ability now to see that, perhaps to say that the positives now outweigh the negatives, because it means that everyone at any walk of life has the possibility of rejuvenating or inflecting or giving themselves an extra bit of mojo. It's often it's well known, for example, that middle-aged men and women get a tattoo as a form of extra virility. And so on. And so the thing is that this idea of adopting different signs and so on is now far more seen as the norm. And it's a way, it has great potential for lifting the self-esteem, but also still of ensuring certain codes of belonging. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Not a question. I would just like to thank the professor for having time to join us and say that we are really honored to have him here. And thank you for this really interesting topic.
I'm greatly. I'm happy to come again sometime. It's great. I hope to visit Croatia. There's a writer's residency in Split, I think, that I want to apply for. And in which case it gives me an excuse to come and visit you guys. So
Yeah,
now that I know you,
please.
and I'd love to come. I'm a Hungarian national. I don't speak Hungarian, but I speak French and German, and I give the very pretentious answer that was what Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt spoke English, French, and German, and not Hungarian. Very pretentious joke. And so thank you very much. I'm very honoured, and again, thank you very much, because I'm gonna, with my colleague Vicky, I'm going to turn this into a full article. So watch this space and watch out. And again, thank you. I've got to go and make dinner now, which again, for my family, breaking gender codes as well. And great to see you and great to meet you. And thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you. It would be great to see you in person, maybe do something with students, and I don't know. It would be really lovely to meet you in person.
Well, I'm working on a sort of a project maybe in Budapest, so I definitely factor that in, and I'll contact you folks. So thank you very much. Have a great day.